Welcome. We are the Mental Barbell, your go-to resource for everything mental performance. We're here to talk about sports psychology, and everything in between. Welcome to the ultimate mental performance journey. Welcome to the Mental Barbell. My name is Ian, and today we're speaking with Coach Mike Mancini of the Mental Barbell. Mike, how are you doing?
Just great, Ian. Just flying through summer. Already about the end of July. How about yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been spending a little bit more time indoors because of the wildfires, but it's given me a lot of time to watch the World Cup and the Stanley Cup and to really catch up on some of the sports that the summer has to offer.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of things happening here. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, we got a great show for everyone listening today. We're going to really focus in on the idea of concentration and focus, talking about what it is, what it isn't, giving you some context and some examples of ways that elite athletes might encounter distractions and how they deal with it. So without further ado, we kind of dive right into the current world of sports. So, we'd be remiss if we didn't start off with the World Cup. I had an absolute blast watching that. Seeing all the different cultures interacting with, the U.S. culture and sports culture. Obviously, it was very fun to watch Spain, take home the cup. But what were some of your moments that you were watching?
Yeah, it was fun always, especially in any kind of tournament like this, where you see kind of the quote unquote Cinderella team give some of the bigger name teams and the teams that were favored to win a run for their money or even beating them. So that's always a lot of fun. But to echo your sentiments, just the experience of just watching everyone just enjoy it from the folks who were there, from the folks who were outside the stadium, like partying beforehand and celebrating afterwards, and even folks in hometown countries who they would, when you watch some of the matches and they would shows like a crowd watching a game in Barcelona or in London because they were watching the UK play or something like that. Just the excitement that you felt connected worldwide is truly a unique experience with the world.
Yeah, and absolutely from a player's perspective too, because it's such an elevated, tournament. It happens every 4 years, very akin to the Olympics. It's something that I think adds even more pressure to those elite athletes who may be used to playing, in the Premier League or the MLS, those high pressure leagues and games. But this is, even more than that. And I was, curious to hear some of your thoughts about, the hype behind the French team going into it. They were, kind of widely considered to be the favorite going in with Mbappe. And if you thought maybe some of that pressure contributed to, their run, not that they had a bad run or anything, but I don't think they quite lived up to the expectations that everybody had for them.
Well, I think the key word you just used it there is expectation. I think as athletes and as teams, that can really be a cloudy area when you're trying to when we talk about focus and concentration because we're consistently judging ourselves against those expectations and a lot of times that's why when you talk to athletes or teams they love being the quote unquote underdog because they feel that they don't have that pressure of the expectation to do well and so they feel like they can play a little bit more free. So we as mental performance coaches always talk about with teams and with individual athletes how to work with those expectations so they don't cloud your vision and your drive and your play to play performance because you hope to just stay in that moment versus, oh my gosh, we've got to win this game, or oh my gosh, I've got to score 2 goals, or whatever the case may be. And that consistently drives your play versus just kind of letting it flow a little.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the context of our conversation today, it's really about what you're paying attention to. Are you paying attention to the commentators that have, very high expectations, or your fans, or are you paying attention to the job that's in front of you? If you're a striker, putting shots on frame, if you're a defender, putting your foot in front of the shots, and so it's really about where your attention is placed rather than trying to block it out. And that's something that I think will come up a little bit later. I also think because it's such an international stage, those players have a lot more eyes on them. And so any mistake feels, bigger than it might really be, with just the viewerships and things like that of each game. A lot of athletes might feel that additional pressure, which, for anyone listening, if you're an amateur athlete, these are professional athletes at the height of their game, that are still feeling a lot of the things that athletes all the way down their career feel, right? Nerves before a game, struggling with expectations and all these types of things. So, I think it's interesting to see that struggle at the highest level as well. And then also seeing those folks, succeed, right? The Spanish team was a team that had high expectations, young players, young stars, lots of, kind of hopefulness for their future, and you see them shining. So, the added pressure is not always a bad thing. It just depends on how you engage with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you talk about eyes on you. It doesn't matter if it's millions or billions in the case of a World Cup, or as we deal with high school athletes or other athletes not outside of that arena, it's, the parents looking from the sidelines, or some friends of mine, and I don't want to screw up for them. I don't want to make a mistake in front of those guys, or I don't want to make a mistake for a coach and whatnot. So that pressure is still there, whether you're playing a high school match or whether you're playing at the New York Giants stadium for the World Cup final. So
Right. Yeah, and we know that, if you feel that hesitation, that anxiety, that don't mess up mentality, your body responds in kind, right? Your body gets tense. Those movements become a little bit more laborious. You're not as automatic in what you're doing, and you really do see kind of that's where athletes tend to choke under pressure, is when they start to succumb to the pressure rather than letting it push them forward. Some other interesting news from basketball. We just saw LeBron's his last decision, allegedly, going out to Philly. So from an Ohio boy here, it's a little bit hard for him to see him not go back to Cleveland. But I was curious to hear what some of your thoughts were, and how that both affects players in the league, both on his old teams, new teams, maybe some of those potential teams. How does his decision really impact the mindset of those teams?
Well, again, I think if you were one of those teams that, or a player on one of those teams that you hope he would choose, and we're going to talk a little bit more about distraction here in a few minutes, but that could be a distraction even here in the offseason going in. You may have had some thoughts, well, if LeBron joins us here, we could do X, Y, or Z, or this is how my role would change on the team if we bring him on. And so there's a lot of different thoughts that play into that. So now for his 76er teammates, that's a different story than everyone else who may have been in that pool of teams that, well, maybe so, maybe he can, or maybe is he thinking of us, and that kind of thing. So I think there's a little bit of that, and for others, I think there might be a little bit of an added edge. I saw somewhere where this was similar to, I believe, when the Miami Heat put together kind of a dream team, and you felt this edge with other teams going into playing them. And now that they had all these guys, Dwayne Wade, I think LeBron was part of that, and I forget who else was a part of that dream team. And they're like, you want to be the dream team? Well, watch us, kind of a thing. And so I think for a lot of other teams, it might be an extra added edge now that when they play the 76ers, for them to kind of show them that, you need to think about us as well, too. So there's two sides of that coin a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Playing with a little bit something to prove.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a great mindset. And that's actually come up a few times in conversations that I've had with athletes about, like, the environment that you're in. Maybe it's not perfect, people complaining about stuff, or people are distracted, but how can you use that to your benefit, right? If you hear somebody distracted, or you hear somebody kind of complaining, maybe in this situation that they didn't get LeBron, this is a way for you to get an edge over that person. If you're the team that's able to, like you said, play with a little bit of something to prove over the team that is just kind of lamenting the loss of LeBron, they're going to have that competitive edge. So I think that's a really good point. I also wonder, what it does to, some of the other players in Philly. I know they just drafted Jaylen Brown, and some of that, like he might have expected to kind of be the superstar, and maybe similar to what happened down in Miami. About now they have to kind of figure out what their roles are, and who's the guy who takes the buzzer beater shot, and who's the guy who passes, that kind of stuff. But be very interesting. One of my favorite pieces to all this was it really feels like he is kind of getting back to his roots, taking the, $8 million over 2 years is a drop in the bucket to what he probably could have made.
Right.
But it's about, the love of the game, or at least it seems like it's about, being competitive again, which I think so many athletes at that level, it does become a paycheck. And so to see him kind of fight against that is pretty cool to see.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think that'll be interesting to see if that does anything with athletes in general in and not necessarily maybe just the NBA, but in MLB and in the NFL. Are there players that might towards the end of their careers or at that stage of their career might they look at might there be more of them who look at that different types of situations as I want to be in that situation versus I need to make this kind of money? And I think there's different stages in a professional athlete's career where you might be looking in both directions there, which way do I go? But that is a little bit of an outlier. You don't really see that. And it'll be interesting to see, especially that a player of LeBron's caliber do something like that if that changes at all anywhere else.
Yeah, and it's you kind of a lead by example situation. Seeing the best athletes, really in the world, kind of following that competitive nature, and that you're absolutely right. Hope that others follow. I also think that that's going to happen probably in the MLB a little bit too, with the salary cap discussion. Some of those superstars probably are going to have to take a smaller paycheck to create the team that they want around them. So interesting to kind of watch those two different motivation levers getting pulled at the
Right.
same time with those
Right.
professional athletes. We also just wrapped up the Tour de France. I thought that was worthwhile talking about. In the context of distractions, obviously we'd have to talk about the wildfires out in France, and how almost cataclysmic it is out there for those riders to be riding through the wildfire smoke. And I think some of the what do they call them, the individual legs got shortened in order to share some of the police resources. So, just as an athlete, how you're able to maintain focus on cycling, and on the course that you're to follow and all this stuff when you have, these wildfires going on around you, all these changes to your course and things like that. So we had a Tadej Pogacar. He won again. It's not his first time winning, so he's been there before. But I think doing it under these different conditions was an interesting context as well.
Yeah, I think that is a great example of not everything's going to go perfect in your event. And I think there's a lot of athletes who that's a struggle. You're a basketball player and you're expecting this, and this to happen. And when it doesn't, even if it's a small thing, it can throw somebody off so much so that it affects your confidence and it affects the ability to kind of stay focused and locked in and stay in the moment and be able to overcome any unforced errors you may have and whatnot, and kind of lead to that proverbial the wheels coming off. And so, again, this is we're talking about distraction and focus and concentration today, and that's a perfect example of being able to kind of readjust your thought process, even going into a leg, knowing that that's going to be short today, or we're going to cut something off today. That changes your strategy, that changes your outlook, that changes your physical prep maybe a little bit as well too. Being shorter, can you push it at certain elements of the leg a little more than you would have not normally done otherwise? There are a lot of elements there, and if you're struggled to kind of handle that, then it's going to throw you off and going to distract you to a point where you're not going to be as competitive as you'd like.
Yeah, and to kind of tie all these stories together, I think there is an aspect of, ideal versus actual. Your ideal Tour de France, your ideal, LeBron team, whether for those World Cup players, your ideal expectations of how good everyone thinks you should be. You end up paying attention to the difference between the ideal and the actual rather than just paying attention to the actual, which is what's real. And it's in that, splitting of your attention that then you maybe make errors while you're playing, or you're thinking about, well, if this had gone this way, I would have been able to do better. And so it all kind of gets wrapped up into this one big ball of distraction. And we're going to talk in our main topic today about different strategies, not necessarily to ignore the distractions, but to really laser in on what exactly is important and what will make your performance better, rather than kind of all the decoration or the dressing around it that can be a distraction. So I thought those were some very great insights.
Yeah, I think the key for every athlete is to understand that you're going to get challenged, whether individually as an athlete or collectively as a team. You're going to get challenged. What that challenge might be, you probably don't know what that could be. We'll go back to the NBA. I know we talked about it in our last podcast. We'll go back to the NBA Finals, where one of the games where the Knicks were down 29 points. They were challenged. You can get really distracted by that and start thinking, well, this game's over with, we're done, forget about it, or whatnot, and not be prepped for that, and let that take over. Or you can go into an event knowing you're going to be challenged, and then the strategy becomes, how am I dealing with those challenges as they come?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we're going to talk about. I mentioned a few times, but in our main topic and in our research today, it's about redirecting your attention back to what's important. We talked kind of a little bit before we hopped on here about, it's not necessarily that you're focused or you're not focused. It's not black and white like that. It's more about what you're focused on. Your focus is always there. It just needs to be on what's important in that moment and not, elsewhere. So, a lot of the examples that we've talked about too have been kind of part of sports. And that's, I think, to what you're speaking to, is that, distractions, challenges, those are really a part of what we do. That's what makes sports special. That's what makes it different than just, training or, a hobbyist. But there are also distractions that happen outside of sports. And these are things that are, regrettably a part of sports. Things like in the WNBA, the harassment that some of the athletes are facing. Last year there were some incidents about things being thrown on the court and stuff like that. And those are distractions that are you hope that they're not there at all, but if they are, it's not a part of the sport. It's just extra stuff. And so I bring this up just to kind of demonstrate that these distractions can be part of sports and kind of necessary to learn how to deal with, but also kind of unfortunate, side effects maybe of specific sporting groups and things like that. So both are important and both can be addressed in really the same way. And that's what we'll talk about.
Yeah,
Did you have any other?
yeah, I was just going to say, I think just in general, social media is the one that I know we've dealt with athletes and with teams as well too. That can be a real distraction. If had the instance of a high school quarterback who didn't have a great game against a rival team and was really bothered by some of the social media stuff he was seeing on whatever, Instagram, Facebook, and whatnot, and something that we had to kind of address and talk through, because you're right, Ian, there's a lot more, I think, of that outside the world of sport that can be a life distraction as well as a sports distraction as well, too.
Absolutely. And I think it's important here to distinguish, there's really two types of distractions, those that are internal and those that are external. So on some of the things that we've talked about, they've been internal distractions. So thinking about, the expectations and how, how do I wish I was playing versus how I'm actually playing. That's something that's going on in your own mind, right? That's what we would call an internal distraction. But then things like, that social media criticism, or even just physical distractions, somebody making a noise in the crowd or something, that's external. And so I think it's really important for anyone listening to decide really where the distraction is happening. So for the athlete that you talked about, the social media is external, but it sounds like it became an internalized distraction. Now that athlete has internalized that outside noise. And so, I think awareness is always where we start. So for yourself, think about, do I tend to be distracted by the noise in the crowd, or by that nagging thought in the back of my head that I can't really get rid of? And that distinction is really important for our conversation moving forward. I think, as we always do, we want to support our conversations with research, and that's exactly what we'll do here. There was a research study came out in 2026 earlier this year from Blumberg and colleagues. I'll leave the link and citation in the description for anyone that wants to read it. But this research group took 198 athletes, and these were all elite athletes, which is good for our research context. They were about 18 years old, so about in the prime of their athletic career for most of them. They came from a variety of sports. These are the subjects. So they came from team and individual sports, speed sports, so running and racing, some strength sports, so lifting and Olympic lifting, and then precision sports, so things like shooting and archery. And the research group really wanted to find out what attention styles are important, and kind of what styles are each category of athlete really using. And so they found some interesting things in that a lot of the athletes had the same level of attention. It was just how they directed it. So they found that a lot of most of the athletes kind of went through cycles of in the zone and out of the zone thinking. So sometimes they were hyper focused, and sometimes they were a little bit less focused. And with that, they found that when the athletes were less focused, they often made more errors, were less consistent, and things like that. So there was a high correlation there between concentration and performance, which is helpful, to know. But the main takeaway of this study is that these elite athletes never stay focused all of the time, right? It's something that waxes and wanes during any normal performance, any normal competition. But what these researchers found is that the most elite athletes were able to go from out of the zone back to the zone more readily, more easily. Whereas the athletes that got distracted and stayed distracted, their performance never really rebounded in the way that the others did. So, the takeaway message for us is that it's never an all or nothing. You're never focused for a game or not focused for a game. It's all about, redirecting your attention to what's important in each moment rather than taking it all at once.
Yeah, I think that's a great reference to a research study, Ian, because we deal with that with athletes all the time, and I think the common perception is to try and block out the distraction, whereas the way we teach it is to your point is it's not the blocking out piece, it's what are you focused on in the moment. And different sports and different roles require a different way of dealing with that. Are you focused in on just one small item here in the moment to help you execute, versus a minute later you may have to take a broader view of your focus because the event changes in depending on your sport, and now you have to take a look at where the play is developing as an individual player, whether you're a defensive back playing football or something changes and you're in the basketball and your shot, you take a shot, it misses, and now you're playing defense. So what's your focus in that moment as well too? So great research piece to kind of back all of that up, that it's not the blocking out piece. It's just, as you mentioned, what am I focused on here in the moment?
Yeah. And I love that you're talking about that, because I think there's an element of compounding distractions. So let's say, you're not able to, or you feel like you're not focused on the right things. Then you start to pay attention to the feeling of being distracted. And then you pay attention to getting frustrated about the feeling of being distracted, right? And so the trying to focus, trying to concentrate often becomes the problem. And then that exponentially becomes more and more internal distractions. And so what you're saying is it needs to be more of a gentle kind of redirection of what you're paying attention to. And we're going to talk here in a second about Nidifer's model of attention. I think it's a really helpful model. I can, I'll put it up on the screen here for everyone to look at for a hot second. But basically, it shows that there's really 4 quadrants of attention, and that is across internal versus external, parallel to what we were saying with the distraction. So, is your focus out into the world, or is it into your own mind, into your own body? And then we have broad and narrow. So among those those 2 categories, we have 4 quadrants. Not going to go over really each one of them, but they all have different combinations. So you could be external and broad, meaning you're kind of scanning the environment around you. And then on the other side of that, you could be narrow and internal, thinking about like one specific thought in your mind during the game. And so it's your ability to move between these different quadrants, both outside of your own mind, inside of your own mind, scanning versus kind of planning and executing with that narrow mindset. So I think that's a really helpful backdrop to have. So, I don't feel focused. What am I thinking about? Where is my attention? Maybe it's on the stands. If it's on the stands, right, you're in a wide external mindset. And we need to redirect back to something on the field. But don't get frustrated that you're thinking about, the spectators, but allow yourself to gently come back to what's important now.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially in team sports, that your role changes a lot. I think of a hockey player. And they're bringing the puck up the ice, and you have one level of focus. Are you handling the puck, or are you one of the wingers maybe trying to get yourself in a position to get a pass as you enter the offensive zone? If you have control of the puck in the offensive zone, your role and your focus kind of changes a little bit there as well too. Am I in the corner? Am I in front of the net? What is my immediate focus? And that might be a little bit more narrow. Then a puck gets turned over. Now immediately you shift to defense, and you're kind of that external focus. Okay, where is everybody? Where are my teammates? So if one of my teammates is out of place, so to speak, do I kind of cut over and take his spot so we're okay defensively? So that changes continuously, as you mentioned. So it's important to that awareness piece. Where am I at? And then where does my focus need to be here?
Yeah, I think a great example, a topical example also is Lionel Messi. In the World Cup, in this World Cup, and in past World Cups, I guess last World Cup that he played in and won, they noted that he walks more than any other athlete. That he, is on the field just kind of walking from position to position. And people have talked about the idea that he's scanning, right? He's living in that wide external where he's just moving slowly, being aware of everything that's happening, trying to see how things are moving. And then when it's time to execute, when it's time to, go and score that Messi magic goal, he's able to switch into narrow internal or narrow external, where it's like, I have one thing that I'm focused on doing. And so it's that his ability to switch from that external wide to external narrow or internal narrow, that really makes him, I think, one of the best athletes that certainly in my lifetime. And I think that's I'll put a link down there as well about some of the tracking data that they have on him, about how much he walks. But I really do think that's exactly what's happening. Is it's makes it easier for him to scan and be aware of the field of play, rather than getting so wrapped up in your kind of blinders, your one narrow job. And then maybe you miss kind of the creative goal or whatever that Messi might see that others might miss. So, again, it all comes back down to this ability to switch between styles of attention. Are you, what is it that you're paying attention to? And I think that brings up really the main point here, is that your focus needs a target. And I'll give, the example here. I think we've done this before, but anybody listening, I'll give you about 5 seconds here. I want you to do anything but think of a pink elephant. And I know Mike laughed there. It's obviously a lot harder to do than you think, right? Because I gave you the target of a pink elephant. It doesn't matter that I told you not to focus on it, but that's what your attention received as the target. And so, when you're thinking about a recruiter in the stands or your parents in the stands or whatever it might be, that's the target of your attention. You just need to give yourself a new target. It's not about blocking it out. It's about giving yourself a new target. And one of the best ways to do that is with a mantra or with some repeated thought that you have, to remind yourself to get, to kind of snap out of it and get back to what's important. Mike, I'll ask you if you have any mantras that you've used, but my favorite is the win mantra. What's important now? If you find yourself feeling distracted, just think what's important right now, right? What is the next moment that I need to be ready for?
I copied mine from Ken Ravizza. Ken used to use WTNP, a radio call, win the next play.
Yeah.
And so I try and use that for myself as well as with my athletes too. And a lot of times when, as you explain the process really well, Ian, of the focus and the concentration piece, for a lot of athletes, that's almost, as we teach that, you could almost feel a sigh of relief come from them because they found it very, very comforting knowing that there's an actual strategy here, because the blocking stuff out thing really hadn't been working because it's cloudy, it's not real focused in. What am I blocking out? How am I doing that? Whereas the real piece to that, as you aptly put, is where is my focus right now? And that even helps with, obviously, we work with moving past mistakes, unforced errors that you may have. You're a shortstop and you booted a ball and let a couple of runs scored. What are you focused on to win the next play, for that next pitch, that next hitter, or even when you go up to bat the next time, 2 innings later? Are you still thinking about that error, or how can I put myself in the best position here to what am I focused in on in this moment to execute this at bat for this pitch right now? And that's a complete difference than I need to block out that internal distraction of that error that I just made.
Yeah, 100%. And kind of go a little bit off the rails here, but I have a background in Eastern philosophies, and one of the Zen kind of Buddhist stories that often gets told is that there are two monks walking down a street, and monks are notoriously not allowed to touch a woman. They're very chaste people. They're not allowed to even just like touch their hand or anything like that. And these two monks are walking down the street, and they see a woman who's struggling to get across the road. And the one monk, walks by, and the other monk actually picks the woman up and helps her get across the road. And they continue on down the road, and they're walking in silence. And then, the first monk chooses to say, why did you touch her? Why did you pick her up? It's against our code. And the other monk says, I may have picked her up, but you've been carrying her this whole time. Meaning that thing that happened has been with that other monk the whole time. Whereas, the monk that actually helped and helped the woman was able to leave it in the past. And that's exactly what you're saying. No matter what that last at bat looked like, you have to put it down. You have to leave it behind you. And I find it so interesting that, we find that through sports, but, this idea is thousands of years old, of kind
Right.
of moving past, a quote unquote mistake or something like that. Which also shows that it's a lot easier said than done. It's something that humans have been grappling with this whole time. And to your point, it can be comforting to know that, you're not in this boat alone. So that's a great point.
Yeah, and it's real critical too, because it ties in a lot of the strategies and the techniques that we teach when we talk about, what does present moment really mean? That this is part of that. What is moving past mistakes? What does that mean? It's not just, as we've been talking about, it's not just your unforced error at shortstop or your missed free throw with 2 seconds left to go in a game or whatever the case may be. It can be that distraction of somebody yelling in the stands, or for the Tour de France riders, the shorten legs. That's a distraction. Something else that I know has happened infrequently, but where some technical glitch has happened in an indoor sport where, let's say, half of the lights go out and they have to stop the game for a few minutes. And that's a distraction, or a rain delay in a baseball game. That's a distraction. So, how you're continuously dealing with that is all part of that resilience piece, staying in the moment. What are we focused on in the moment right now that can help us execute? And even including confidence. Do I have confidence in myself to execute this particular skill in this moment as well too? So it's a real foundational piece to what we work with athletes and teams all the time.
Absolutely. And a quick anecdote here, actually from one of our past episodes with my father. He was talking about working with, he's actually the world's greatest athlete in the 96 Olympics and the 2000 Olympics. His name was Dan O'Brien. And in this course of competition, he had a really catastrophic performance in the Olympic trials, and specifically in the high jump, not even making like practice heights that he had cleared, in warm up and things like that. And it actually, in the decathlon in the next Olympiad, they were playing his failure, his catastrophic failure, the 4 years before, on the screen behind the high jump bar. And so, how would you like to be there, where you're standing there about to go 4 years later, after 4 years of training and all this hard work, and the reminder of your career failures playing. And the really interesting thing was the work that my father and Dan had done. He didn't even notice it, right? Because again, he had given his attention something else to chew on, right? He was focused on the ground in front of his feet rather than what was going on around him. And so, it wasn't a matter of how do I ignore that? It was a matter of I didn't even notice it. And I thought, that's a perfect example of what we want anyone listening here, that those distractions just kind of fade away. If anyone's ever seen the movie, I think a Disney movie, The Greatest Game Ever Played. It's a story of Francis Ouimet. There's a really famous scene where he's standing on the tee box and he's so focused on the green and the flag that the course seems to shorten. All of the fans and everything around kind of fade away. And I thought that was one of the best depictions of what this process can feel like. When you're just so engrossed in one thing that everything else just disappears. So, just to share those couple of stories.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that movie, by the way, and I remember that scene. But yeah, that's a great visual depiction of what this can be. And as you mentioned, if it was really easy, we probably wouldn't be talking about this, right? But and there is that challenge there, and the idea is that you can overcome that. You can work with that, and you can learn strategies and practice those, and implement, and see how it works for you, and then work at it some more and get better at that. And that just helps with that resilience and that focus piece that can help you be the best version of yourself as you come out of that event.
Yeah, and I would love to talk about some of those techniques that we use for athletes, but I think the danger in doing it in a platform like this is that not everything works for everyone. You really have to get background on a person and find out exactly what those disruptions are, what those distractions are, to then start recommending techniques and things like that. The one that I like to use kind of universally is the idea of a mantra, having a thought that is practiced and that has power for you, can be very helpful. But for most athletes, picking something to focus on, whether it be a part of your body, some people like to try to feel their pinky toes because it's kind of hard. So it really takes a lot of your attention, or, a spot on the field or something like that. But giving your attention a target, I think, is one of the best techniques. Beyond that, I recommend you reach out to somebody, whether it be Mike and myself, or someone else that you can kind of bounce ideas off of and find out exactly what is distracting you. That's where the techniques then will have some power. nothing that we do is really one size fits all. And that's why we do tend to stay away from those specific interventions in this platform.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of different ways we can approach that with an athlete. And you're right. Every athlete's going to be a little bit different with that. And so we try and work with each individually to see where our techniques or strategies might be best for you individually moving forward.
Yeah. I think, and this is moving into our mental fitness challenge, but I think it's important to remember that none of these skills are fixed, right? If you're somebody that thinks that you have a hard time concentrating, I would really recommend changing that mindset into, it's a skill that you need to practice and to work on. I think the best kind of imagery here for any of these mental skills is that they're like muscles. They're like mental muscles. And the more that you practice them, the stronger that they get. And then the easier it all becomes. And so, practicing the awareness of where your attention is, and then also practice that redirection. How do I redirect from an external focus to an internal focus, or backwards, or from a wide to an internal? And that's what we really recommend practicing for our mental fitness challenge this month. So, if you're somebody who likes to journal and write things down, this would be a great kind of prompt. But if not, it's something to think about and to kind of mull over. So we want you to think of 3 moments in your sport, 3 moments. A moment where you might need that broad external attention. So when you're, maybe that messy moment where you're walking, scanning the field, kind of looking for an opportunity. Then I want you to think about a time when you need a narrow external attention. And that's often you're focusing on something in your field of play, whether it be the ball or the puck or the defender that you're looking at, right? You're really lasering in on that one thing in your environment that you need to focus on. And then we want to work on moving between those. So we want to move between paying attention to the field around us, to the ice around us, and zooming in kind of to that moment of execution. So again, if you think back to the messy conversation, that moment going from I'm walking and scanning to maybe I see an opportunity and I'm going to laser in on that opportunity and then go execute my task. So how you can make that transition from awareness to execution is really crucial. Mike, did you have any thoughts there about ways to maybe enhance our mental fitness challenge, or any recommendations?
It's really, I think the key piece to that, you had mentioned it, is awareness. And that's why we start out with that is I think we gloss over a lot of this stuff ourselves, thinking we are aware of where our thoughts are, or our emotions are, or where physically we're feeling some of that, which can be an awareness piece in and of itself. That if my shoulders are tight, that must mean something. And what is that something? And
Yeah.
so I think the big key to that is essentially to kind of get better at becoming more aware of where you're at physically as well as thought wise. And at the more you can get better at that, then you can get into, you can do it a little bit quicker in terms of, all right, I'm feeling tense in the moment. Why is that? Now I understand. If I can understand why, now I can understand where I can put my focus and my concentration in the minute, in that moment in and of itself. So I think it really all kind of starts with that foundation of awareness and in getting better at that, if that makes any sense.
100%. And the process that we're talking about here is metacognition. So it's thinking about your own thinking. So often we identify one to one with our thoughts. We are our thoughts. If you can create some separation between you and your experience and the thoughts that you have, in that space, you can then evaluate the thoughts. You can say, are these helping me? Are they maybe hindering me? Are they distractions? Am I focused on the right things? But it's that skill of creating a little bit of space between you and your thoughts, and then almost being your own coach, your own sports psychologist. Evaluate your thinking, evaluate your mindset, and then you use critical reasoning and logic to then think about what do I need to do to fix it. And that's it's harder, or it's easier said than done, as we've mentioned, but it's kind of the skill that underlines everything else. If you're able to metacognize, think about your own thinking, then you're able to adjust your own thinking too. And we just use the word awareness, but absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a great exercise for everyone to do and a great mental fitness challenge for the month.
Awesome. And, we'd love to hear your comments about how that experience was for you, any questions that you have, any comments that you had in that process, and what some of your outcomes were. So we'd love to hear those in the comments. But for now, that's a wrap for episode 24 of the Mental Barbell podcast. If today's episode helped you think differently about mental toughness, concentration, or mental performance, do something with it this week. Pick one hard moment in practice, training, or competition and use it to focus as a mental rep. And if you want to help building those skills more intentionally, visit thementalbarbell.com to learn more about mental performance coaching for athletes, teams, coaches, and parents. You can also follow along on our journey on social media at The Mental Barbell across all platforms for more tools, worksheets, and mental training content. If this episode was useful, subscribe, leave a review, and send it to one athlete or coach who needs to hear it. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.